Algerian weekly Révolution Africaine asserted in its first issue, published in February of 1963, that the purpose of their journal was to, quote, make known the struggle of the people of these territories and to call all men enamored with liberty and progress to struggle at their side, end quote. On the same spread, a letter from Robert Rescha, the African National Congress's representative in Algeria, argued that the journal, quote, must be the voice of our people. More than simply bringing news to the freshly independent Algeria, the publication was perceived as a collaborative tool, a rallying cry for independence movements. In this paper, based on the examples of Révolution Africaine and the French magazine Partisans, I provide a preliminary framework for how to use borderland studies to analyze print media's role as political organ and social connector. For groups whose contact could not take place in geographical spaces, I argue that we can think about politicized media, in this case left publications in the 1960s, as a textual space of exchange, as a border between individual experiences. Not only did publications physically connect people across international spaces, but they also created a community of international readers who defined themselves by this exchange. This is a study of words and context, of ideas and the people who read and connected with them, meeting metaphorically at the edge of the page. The internationalism of the Francophone left in the 1960s makes the application of borderland studies to their media particularly fruitful. Partisans, a non-party journal from Paris, and Révolution Africaine, based in Algeria, were important sources of political organization and identity formation for Francophone leftists in these years. Both publications had international reach, long print runs, and a strong influence on contemporaneous politics, making them relatively comparable. Leftist publisher François Maspero founded Partisans in 1961 as a home for theoretical analysis from and debate between anti-colonial activists within and beyond France. Partisans was committed to the international from its inception, as was Révolution Africaine. Published out of Algiers from 1963 to 1968, Révolution Africaine was founded as one of two official Algerian government organs that promoted the liberation of all African peoples. I will focus on these two publications as sites of exchange, but the left media landscape of the 1960s was rich with publications to which a similar analysis could be applied. So this paper is as much a theoretical recommendation as an empirical study, advocating for the benefit of applying borderland studies to the history of 20th century media landscapes. I'll explain a few key aspects of borderland studies, highlighting how this dynamic field, in combination with methods of early modern reading culture, can help us think about media as a form of cross-cultural interaction and identity formation. I will then lay out two specific applications of borderland studies that demonstrate how this framework changes our understanding of partisans and Révolution Africaine's impact on and relationship with audiences. The recent studies of national and imperial borderlands see borders as, quote, places where states, individuals, and various groups interact within the context created in part by institutionally defined borders. As described by Redman et al. In Borderlands and World History, borders are places where the best efforts of states aside, ideas, goods, people move among various contact zones. Contact zones thus foster the creation of a culture based on cross-border movement. While scholars assume that border spaces are rooted in a certain physicality, there's little reason why contact zones have to be a geographical space when, particularly for the late 20th century, the movement of media made contact without travel increasingly feasible. Of course, borders are rooted in statehood, in the creation of sociopolitical difference, and the enforcement of belonging as a way to create a nation. However, as Thomas Wilson and Hastings Donnan have argued, scholars of borderlands have increasingly thought about borders as part of a complex relationship between national and international culture and identity. In other words, as a process of cultural exchange premised on differentiated experience. Wilson and Hastings argue that while the state is an important consideration, scholars are traveling further from the geographic border zone to emphasize how borders can be, quote, shifting, porous, and mobile. Border studies have moved conceptually and spatially away from literal borders to examine the relational interactions of identities tied to the structures of border spaces and cultures, as well as the creation of exchange-based group identity associated with borderlands. So if we can accept that borders do not have to be physical space, and instead think of borderland studies as underscoring how exchange between cultures and individuals serves to cement identity and political desire, then we can build on this theoretical framework. My argument here combines modern borderland studies with studies of early modern print culture to show how print media can serve to create a transnational, affective, emotional, and political community not reliant on physical interaction. As historians like Lynn Hunt and Benedict Anderson have shown, text is more than a way to transfer ideas. Reading text can build an empathetic community or create a sense of synchronous experience. I argue that international leftist publications from the 1960s facilitated transnational exchange, fostered debate, and created a community based on these values. They created a textual world, a sort of intellectual space upon which identities could be mapped, even without the accompaniment of physical space. Border studies underscores the social and political impact these processes had on readers, despite their physical distance. There are two important ways in which borderland studies can be applied to these leftist publications. First, in the way the text traverses physical and conceptual space, and second, in the defining and policing of a new group identity. First, I'd like to argue that borderland studies highlights how media traverses geographic space, connecting people without physical movement. The two publications I'm focusing on were distinctly international. Partisans was distributed around the Francophone world, printed in Paris, and distributed to Southeast Asia, North America, Africa, and all over Europe. Révolution Africaine was extremely popular across Africa, and even provided a monthly Anglophone publication released in London and New York. Individual readers could not possibly be expected to travel to Algeria, to South Africa, and Los Angeles, or Cuba to learn about other struggles, but publications could serve as a sort of borderland, a lens through which to observe different lived experiences, ideas, and gain insights. Readers could conceptually traverse geographical space by simply purchasing a paper. The articles in Partisans and Révolution Africaine show how publications served as an intellectual frontier. The summer of 1971 issue of Partisans featured articles on nationalism and class struggle by Marxist intellectuals Ernst Mandel and Maxime Rudé, borrowed from a 1971 colloquium in Brussels. The authors critique the confluence of nationalism and class struggle, arguing that Marxist theses prove that the nation emerges from bourgeois class conflict and therefore cannot be the end goal of a working class struggle. Partisans' reprint of these presentations from Belgium provided an opportunity for readers to consume and engage with their ideas, particularly important as only a small number of readers could have attended the conference. Such articles also allowed readers to challenge these ideas, letting community members talk back to intellectuals. A few issues after Mandel and Renaissance article, Partisans printed a response penned by A.S. Nair, an Indian artist and theorist, and Camille Scalabrino, a soixante-huitard and Marxist theorist. Their article adhered more closely to Third World Marxism, arguing that in a Leninist framework, the state can be used, if only temporarily, to further the interests of the working class. The journal allowed two theorists absent the Belgian conference to respond to Mandel and Renaissance, creating space for these individuals to come in contact with one another. A quick glance at the authors' backgrounds shows, too, how diverse experiences impacted the ideas presented in Partisans. Renaissance was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants, a former communist, and a fierce opponent of Israel. He believed that the nation could never serve the working class. Nair, on the other hand, lived through the Indian independence movement. He based his response on the works of Jacques Berck and Anwar Abdelmalek, both also from the Global South, and argued that the nation could, in fact, be of service to the people. One can see how the author's background would have influenced their ideas. Partisans facilitated a conceptual conversation between experiences, as well as about theory, within the pages of the journal. So there are more examples of transnational exchange in these publications than I could possibly talk through here. In March 1963, two editors of Révolution Africaine who traveled to China explained to readers Mao's contributions to Third World Socialism. A few months later, the magazine published a long-form study about Black decolonization in America by French theorist Daniel Guéret. Every issue contained a page of telegrams with news from capital cities around the world. Similarly, Jean-Philippe Talbot's Chronologie Partisane, published in a half-dozen issues of Partisans, provided a brief overview of global events. Many issues of Partisans were entirely dedicated to foreign struggles, from Latin America to South Africa. Political exchanges in the pages of leftist magazines bolstered diverse voices and also spread ideas from place to place, crossing borders and bringing people together without leaving home. When we think of these journals as intellectual borderlands, creating conversations between political and intellectual communities, we can see how they provided more than just information to readers. They provided access to a multicultural community rooted in exchange. So the second way in which borderlands theory explains the importance of publications is in their creation of a new social group, a sort of political identity delineated by participation. Both Partisans and Révolution Africaine sought to demonstrate their commitment to and interactions with the heterogeneous Western left and the Third World. Their identity, as a group of writers and readers, was founded on an imagined audience of anti-colonialist and anti-capitalist militants. Reader responses that reflected these values confirmed the publication as legitimate producers of revolutionary Third World discourse and assured readers they were members of such a community. Transnational acts in and of themselves, these texts speak to the existence of borderland community that the publication created. Editors used a variety of tactics to affirm their community, from printed reader responses to more subtle signals. In its early issues, Révolution Africaine printed letters of support from important international figures to affirm their political community. As noted in the introduction, Robert Rescha, the ANC ambassador to Algeria, wrote a letter to support the publication, as did Bertrand Russell of the Russell Tribunal, which condemned American war crimes in Vietnam, Basil Davidson, a British historian of African decolonization, and Claude Astier, a French socialist politician. Printing public support from well-known figures gave readers of Révolution Africaine a quick way to identify its political orientation, engaged, anti-colonialist, third worldist, and define the contours of their own group. In both Révolution Africaine and Partisans, a whole host of tactics contributed to this process. Writers' names emblazoned on front pages, calls to action from foreign groups, and even reprinted speeches from leaders like Fidel Castro and Ahmed Ben Bella were political signals to shore up a mental landscape of who belonged and who did not. The magazine's tactics defined the boundaries of their political group as one founded on internationalism, a border community that participated in global revolutionary struggles. Readers actively participated in the formation of the publication's group identity, while also expanding the world represented in the pages of the journal, as previously discussed. Both Partisans and Révolution Africaine regularly printed letters from national and international readers. Révolution Africaine's 7th issue, for instance, contained letters from readers in La Réunion, Morocco, Algiers, and Paris, and even one from the vice president of the Fédération des étudiants africains en URSS, writing in from Moscow. Such international letters emphasized the audience Révolution Africaine valued and hoped to augment, one whose diversity made it more than just an Algerian newspaper. Having a clear identity not only benefited the journals by attracting readers, but also provided personal, intellectual, and social benefits to readers by virtue of their participation. Rooted in an ideal of democratic exchange, these publications wanted their community to be responsive and participatory. In one issue of Partisans, a reader from Constantine, Algeria, wrote to say that, quote, "We are numerous here who find in Partisans a useful instrument for the non-directive character of its information. We expect of you that you will retain the revolutionary attitude you claim." By reprinting this letter, the journal allowed a reader to affirm them as a revolutionary publication. At the same time, they provided room for criticism to show that the editors, readers, and writers formed a community. The journal sought to not simply be a voice of authority, but to respond to readers. Critical letters contributed to the definition of the publication's ideology, speaking back to editors and other readers to bolster certain positions or challenge others. More than simply signaling, the publication's Borderland was a common space that marked readers as participants in a world of international exchange, part of a community with similar values and imagined experiences. So the second application of Borderland studies is a little subtler, as it argues that the fact of international exchange discussed previously created a collective identity, a form of sociability dependent on participation within this exchange. Yet publications clearly have a distinct population, their readers, authors, and editorial team. When Partisans and Révolution Africaine printed pieces that demonstrated interactions with different political ideas and international audiences, they were working through the contours of their group's population, policing their borders in a way, and proving that their identity was rooted in the international collaboration of a border zone. When we consider how publications work to define the contours of their group, we see how exchange-based communities resemble borderlands cultures. So in using border studies to frame the work of these publications, I hope to underscore the social importance of leftist publications as places of collaborative exchange, and show how reading functions as part of collective identity formation. Historians of reading culture argue that texts form an important part of political landscapes. Combining this methodology with borderland studies shows how the internationalization of leftist media in the 20th century did more than expand readership. It connected people across physical borders, diversified intellectual debates, and fostered a participatory international group identity. While not the only way to study these publications, I do believe that Borderlands framework provides us extremely useful tools. Through these examples, we see how the pages of leftist publications created a well-populated intellectual space, a sort of radical borderland where people and ideas met. I explained a few initial ways here in which borderland studies can be paired with reading history to help scholars understand publications' complex social and political roles. So I'll end on an open invitation. Though I think political publications are particularly ripe for analysis, most non-undergrad publications can be seen as a borderland in the way I have outlined. And I absolutely welcome all work that expands, explores, and even challenges the application of borderlands theory to studies of print media. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to discussing and any questions people have.